Hello, my name is Alana, and I am your host for Beyond the Button Mash. This is a podcast intended to be a congregational space and a meeting space for gamers to come forward and discuss the more serious topics in the gaming industry. When I originally invited Jack Stratz on to do this episode, I had the intention of doing 2 or 3 episodes regarding Gamergate 2.0. But as I continued to edit and to listen and to wait and watch as to everything that's going on with this issue, I realized that this is not as multifaceted as Gamergate 1 would have been. Throughout this episode, you will hear mentions and references to another episode, and by all means, I mostly had this plotted out and sort of what I was going to talk about. And I wanted to talk about specifically the 24-hour news cycle and the idea and the concept that we need to look at our sources more often. We need to read and think about the intention of what was said, and not just always things at face value. And as much as I do want to talk about those issues, and I think they're important, I think Gamergate 2.0 was mostly just about the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that what we said in this episode, I can stand by confidently. I'm happy that we had this conversation. I learned a lot, and it is my honest and true hope that you will learn a lot from listening too. Because the way that we move forward from situations like this and the way that we grow from everything that can happen in something like this is through conversation. Gaming is a social thing, and it is my every intention with this podcast to bring gaming back to that, to being something social. Let's talk about our issues and let's try and find a solution for them. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast rebrand and welcome to Beyond the Button Mash. Today we're talking about Sweet Baby Inc., and this is our second episode on this, and we have Jack Stratz here as a guest. Jack Stratz is a friend of mine and also a Twitch streamer, but he has a background in diversity and inclusion as well. Jack, do you want to take a step into that and kind of give us your background?
Sure. Hi everyone. Thank you, Alana, for having me today. I'm really pleased to be talking with you. So like Alana said, I am a Twitch streamer. I stream focusing on strategy and SRPG games, but I've also worked for coming up on 10 years now in diversity and inclusion related roles. I've worked as an internal diversity and inclusion assistant and provider, and I've also worked externally as a kind of consultant to a variety of different sectors, from finance, tech, professional services, legal, higher education, all sorts. So I'm really excited to be here and to be diving into this topic. It's a bit of a big topic, but I think it's great to start the conversation here.
Well, I'm super happy to have you here, especially in terms of the diversity and inclusion, because that is something that I am not super well versed in. And I think having the conversation with someone with that knowledge base is helpful for everyone involved. So.
I think it's, I know we talked a little about this prior to the podcast, but I think there's that apprehension and that uncertainty when approaching a conversation about diversity and inclusion and about this topic. I think it's something that everyone goes through. I know we're going to touch on that a bit later anyway, but I think taking the first step and pushing yourself to start the conversation is the most important thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I've started to do that in my personal life and in my professional life as well, and now in gaming too. So it's really kind of happening in all a roundabout way and all at the same time. And it's interesting how it all just kind of comes together, right? Slowly but surely. And you learn so much from all other aspects of your life. So I think we're going to jump in and we're just going to start with sort of what happened for anyone listening who's unaware of what Gamergate 2.0 is. So there are two main beats to this conversation that's happening. And the first is Steam curation group that appeared called Sweet Baby Inc. Detected by, I apologize if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Cabretis. And it has confirmed titles that Sweet Baby Inc. has worked on. Sweet Baby Inc. is a consulting company from Montreal, and they help with writing, narrative, representation, and development. So in terms of just bringing people on for, well, better representation in your games. They're more like a script doctor. They're not changing a huge amount of things, but they are tweaking things in stories and helping it seem more inclusive and better representation. So they've worked on titles like God of War Ragnarok, Alan Wake 2, and Spider-Man Miles Morales. I think there's about 19 titles that we know for sure they've worked on in this curation group, and the curation group currently has over 370,000 followers, so it's definitely making waves within the gaming community. The second point is Danny Lalonders, who formerly worked for Sweet Baby Inc., gave a talk at the GDOC, which is the Game Dev of Color Expo. I think it's tied directly with the GDC, so the Game Developer Conference, but I'm not entirely sure. And it was in 2021 regarding 1 year in the industry. And during the talk, Lalonders discusses the concept of building a team to support the creation of your game. A 48-second clip was shared by the Twitter account Libs of TikTok, and it went pretty viral. I think it was sitting over 6 million views, and it just is spurring discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the gaming industry, including the hiring sector, as unfortunately Lalonders did greatly make it seem like they don't hire white people. I don't think she was saying that. I don't believe that was the intention, but it was, she was only in the industry for 1 year. They were probably very new to all of the conversation and were given a really big opportunity, and perhaps it just didn't land in the way that they were expecting. So do you have anything you want to add to that, Jack, in terms of what we're going to be talking about today?
I was thinking I could talk a little about the Daniel Launders clip, and perhaps I think that some of the important parts of that clip got lost, and I think that obviously it was posted by the Libs of TikTok account, and the bit that everyone focused on was what Danny said about hiring an exclusively black team, and I think the bit that the context piece that was within that clip was what she said at the end, which was about avoiding microaggressions. And so what Danny's talking about is wanting to create what we'd probably refer to as an inclusive and equitable workplace, and we'll talk a bit more about those terms in a sec. But wanting to create an environment where people in the workplace don't experience microaggressions, which is something that we should always want to work in a space where no one is experiencing hatred or experiencing anything negative. But I think that the message got blurred by what she said previously about hiring practices. There are different regulations and rules around hiring and equitable and inclusive hiring in different countries. So obviously that might have come into play, but obviously discriminatory hiring practices are typically not allowed. There's an interesting conversation about representation and proportional hiring, and meeting certain targets and diversity quotas. Obviously, I don't know the ins and outs of the organization that Danny was working for and what exactly they were trying to do. But I think that there's a lot of discussion that could come out of that point around trying to avoid microaggressions and creating an equitable workplace that unfortunately hasn't happened because of what Danny said in the first half of that clip around who she's building a team of.
Yeah, well, I think you are correct in saying that. And when I listened back to the clip, and I went and listened to the whole talk, which we've talked about this in the past, but very interestingly only has about 17,000 views. A lot of people haven't gone and listened to the full talk. And when I listened to it, especially that there's a segment called The Team on the YouTube video that's like highlighted, it talks about building a team that supports the game that you're trying to create, right? So you wouldn't have a team of only male writers working to try and make a teenage girl game, right? Like that, how is that going to work? They don't know the experience of what a teenage girl goes through and how to correctly create this representation. And I know that Validate, I've never played it, and I haven't really heard of it a lot before this controversy, but I know it's very queer focused and very like POC focused. So it's probably good to have people who are queer or people of color working on that game because they would understand the best, right, on how to get something like that together.
Yeah. Typically, when you look at, for example, hiring a team of writers for that game, typically the rules and legislative practices around hiring and discrimination in hiring are less are not required to be followed if there is a reasonable requirement for a person to be from a certain identity background. So if you are, like you say, telling a story about queer experiences, in a situation like that, it might be perfectly legal to exclusively want to hire queer writers who have that lived experience. And likewise, I haven't actually come across the game myself either, but perhaps that is the case of what was going on here. Again, it's whenever a clip gets put onto Twitter, obviously there's going to be some level of context that's missing, and like you say, it doesn't seem like a lot of people listen to the full talk, but it has sparked what it has sparked nonetheless.
And I think even if the conversation comes from a bad place, like where it starts, it is opening like another door to a conversation. And it's very different from the original Gamergate movement. That one was very multifaceted and had so much going on. And perhaps 2.0 will grow to that. Like, we don't know yet. We're still very much in the beginning of it. In this time, the reaction has been very different, it feels, if that makes sense, right? Like, it's a lot about, like, okay, let's just actually not, let's stop harassing people. That's not okay. This shouldn't be part of it. And maybe having representation for women or people of color or just people from all walks of lives in games isn't a bad thing, because we've kind of enjoyed the games that are coming forward so far. Like, they're kind of nice. I really like God of War Ragnarok. I'm not a dad. I'm not a single father. Like,
Yeah.
I
I'm not a Norse god either.
yeah,
So I can't
like,
relate to any of Kratos.
but it's been a really cool experience to just see people play that game and how emotional and touching it's been to a lot of people who aren't parents, right? Like, just that experience with Kratos and his son. So
I think as well, all of this emotion that people are feeling, I think it's been bubbling up for a very, very long time, even as far back as the original Gamergate, maybe even longer. I don't know. And I think that Sweet Baby Inc. has kind of come to the forefront at the worst possible time for them. And what I mean by that is they've appeared at the exact moment that a lot of people were looking for a villain or for a target, and unfortunately, Sweet Baby Inc. has kind of fit what people are looking for as something or someone to blame, someone to focus all of these feelings that they're feeling into. But yeah, I think this has been a really long time coming. And like you said, I think it will also be really interesting to see over the next few months, over the next year, however long these conversations continue for, exactly where this goes, and I think the scale to which this grows.
I think it's really interesting too. There hasn't been, from what I've viewed, and I have not viewed every single video on Gamergate 2.0. There's a lot of content to consume in this regard. But within the sphere, there's not a lot of discourse like back and forth that we've seen. Like, and I think that's actually an opportunity where we could all kind of grow and learn and change a little bit, because, you know, you have like the left and the right, and they're just like fighting, but they're only talking to each other. So how is that going to make any sort of resolution for anybody or make anybody feel any better? Because maybe there's no one there to tell us, like, hey, it's okay, right? Like, it's going to be okay. Let's look at it from a different perspective. Like, let's try and like gain some knowledge on it, right? And maybe there's things that I could learn too, like why people are so upset about it. I don't know all of the reasons. I've been doing a lot of reading and trying to understand and get to the bottom of it, but we don't know, like, why are people so upset about this, right? And maybe there's like something to be learned from the other side of what's going on.
There's a very almost apocalyptic narrative in some places, like this gaming is over, gaming is dead, the gaming industry will never recover from this. I think that's slightly exaggeration, but when you're facing or believing something like that, it's very difficult for a dialogue to actually happen. And like you say, and like we said at the start, you know, we have to have a conversation about this, because it's not going to go away. Sweet Baby Inc. and the desire for better representation and more inclusive stories in gaming is not going to go away. And equally, the people that are feeling left out or who are feeling not listened to, they're not going to go away either. They're still going to be engaging with gaming. They're still going to be seeing this. They're still going to be commenting online. They're still going to be being apocalyptic if that's what they're feeling. So something somewhere has to be talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. Yeah, just like coming together in those conversations, because the whole not going away aspect, right? It does feel like quite a bit of Gamergate, like the first Gamergate, didn't go away, right? The distrust in the media, the just blaming like Kotaku, Polygon, whatever outlet we want to. And yes, there are fumbles. Every journalist fumbles at one point or another, right? We've entered the 24-hour news cycle. It's not good for anybody. Like, you don't have time to research, to check your facts, to make sure that you're going in the right direction. And we all have to react in the moment. And I think that just like being able to have the time to ingest everything and deal with everything, and maybe learning something, hopefully, from Gamergate 2, instead of just with Gamergate 1, just keeping it with us and like dragging it along right through the mud, because it's like, okay, eventually, like, we have to stop.
We see all these statements being made, and it's so the reactions happen so quickly, and you know, we see it on both sides. We see people saying, you know, I'm making these up, but you're not allowed to be a man in a video game anymore, you know, and extreme over the top statements like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and people will see that and immediately react rather than seeing that and going, oh, really? Is that actually, and just stopping and thinking, going, is that actually true?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, and just being a little more inquisitive with it. Because 99% of the time, either it's not true or it's not that serious. And I think that if we are just a little more inquisitive and a little more cautious to react emotionally, then perhaps some of it might not get to this heightened point. That being said, I think it's really understandable why people react emotionally, because we're dealing with people, we're presenting stories that people relate to. People connect extremely deeply to the games that they play, and that's a fantastic part of the art form. That's why gaming is so wonderful to me, because of those connections you make to the stories. And so I think it's understandable that people might get defensive when they believe that something's being taken away from them, or something is being done to them that they don't like. And I think that, to a point, some of the resistance to inclusion and more diverse characters in games, I think I understand where it comes from. I don't agree, and I don't think there's actually a good reason for it. But I understand why people are feeling like games aren't being made for them, or like their stories aren't being told anymore. And if we treat that as complete nonsense, if we treat those people with those feelings as completely ridiculous, well, they're certain that's not going to convince most people. But if we talk through it and give people a space to say, here's how I'm feeling, and I'm feeling really upset about it, and hear that and process it with them, that's far more likely to encourage them to also stop and take a breath and take a moment and reflect, rather than this consistent back and forth, you suck, no, you suck, no, you suck, that we see on both sides, really.
And well, the you suck thing, like, is not just gaming exclusive at all,
Of course.
right? And that's one of the most frustrating things for me, given the family that I was raised in, and just the importance of a good discussion, right? Good philosophy, good, like, thinking about it. Like, why do we feel this way, right? And logical fallacies, understanding how to sort of create your argument in a space so you can win, in quotations. But I'm not sure, winning is not as important to me as it once was. It's still important to me in video games. But in an argument, it's not about the winning anymore. It's about the truth, right? Like, let's find and come to a truthful conclusion together and sort through these things, because like you said, like, these feelings are extremely valid, and they're feeling attacked, and they're feeling like they're losing everything. And I think it was really interesting how you talked about how it's been coming for a while, because there are like two lines of thought. One is, we're getting to a big political year for like a lot of the world, the US, Canada, etc. Like, everyone's coming up to elections the next couple of years. So that always like kind of gets people like more involved with their political party and like interested in that kind of stuff, and we get more into the political mindset. But I also think that gaming has evolved so much since like probably the mid to late 2000s. Again, when BioShock came out, like I talk about that all the time, but when BioShock came out, when games, the world started to pay attention and they were like, this game like makes you feel something, right? Like this is a very emotional game. And we saw the release of BioShock, we saw the release of BioShock 2, BioShock Infinite, The Last of Us, Mass Effect, like all these games that really shifted from just being like a game of, hey, I'm the guy and I'm going to save the day, whether it was a guy or a girl in that case, but I'm the person, I'm going to save the day, right? And that's who I am. And you guys are just not powerful enough, but I am. And they made us feel powerful and strong and like the main character. And we just have had like this huge tonal shift. And it's not always about that anymore. It's about like questioning, like, are we actually the good guy? Because sometimes in some games we're not, like, and we're realizing that, right? Like, I'm not the good guy. Maybe it's hard to save the world, or I have to make like really tough decisions along the way. And I think that was like lacking for a long time from storytelling in games. And we're moving towards that. And we're also moving at the same time towards like diversity and inclusion and those kind of conversations, the DEI conversation, right? And if you like have those almost simultaneously happening, it's easy to be upset with the storytelling that's coming forward and being like, well, I just don't like it because people are more diverse now. And that's now why I don't like it.
And it's also happening incredibly fast.
Yeah.
Developments in gaming, in technology broadly, are just getting faster and faster. And I think that's also coming to a head in conversations about AI, in AI art and in AI in gaming and all of those things. But the faster it goes, the less time we have to react, right? Because we've got to either understand or we've got to immediately decide how we feel about something, because there's another new thing around the corner anyway. So we've got to make that snap decision. So it makes it even harder for us to process things that are going on when 500 different things are changing all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. Complete agree. Agree. Like that's that. Okay, end of the podcast, guys. No.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
That's it. So we wanted to talk though a lot about, because we do have a bit of an outline for this episode, and we wanted to talk about sort of diversity versus inclusion, right? Because that's something that I don't know the most about, right? I'm going to let you take the reins on this one, Jack. Difference between diversity and inclusion. Like, give us the 411.
Sure. So you'll typically see diversity and inclusion, and then you'll also very often see an E alongside that, which is either normally equity or equality. They're normally used interchangeably. How I describe them is diversity means difference, right? It means all the differences between us, all the different parts of our identity that make us who we are. And very typically, we think about diversity of identity and minoritized identities like gender, like race, like sexuality, like disability or neurodiversity, age, all sorts. Well, very often that'll be the first thing that people's minds go to. And I think the part of diversity that's also not looked at as much is diversity of thought and diversity of ability and diversity of experience, and people that come from all kinds of different backgrounds that can bring different perspectives based on the things that they've experienced. And there's millions and millions of pieces of research out there, probably not millions, that's probably an exaggeration, but there's tons of research out there that shows that typically the more diverse a team is, the better it performs, because they will consider different things that a more homogenous group of people might not. Diversity is also it's the thing that's easy to measure and it's easy to see, because you can say, okay, how many women are present versus how many men are present. You can, to a point, you can track and count diversity. And diversity was kind of the first big thing. It was, we need to be more diverse in workplaces. We need to be more diverse. We need to bring more people in. And then people started realizing, oh, actually, we're bringing diverse people in, but they're leaving really quickly because the workplace that we're creating for them, or the space we're creating for them, actually isn't very inclusive. So inclusion is making sure that people feel literally like they can be included, like they matter, like their voice is heard. And typically, if you can have a diverse workplace, but if it's not inclusive, like I say, people will go. Inclusion is harder to measure because how do you measure how people feel? And there are things that you can do in workplaces. For example, you can track retention, you can staff surveys, things like that. But it's creating an environment where everyone feels like they can be themselves. They can tell their stories. They don't have to hide or suppress any part of who they are. And then equity or equality is about treating everyone fairly and making sure that everyone has the same access to the space that you're creating. If we think about that in gaming terms, it might be accessibility features that allow people with mobility issues or subtitling so that people who are hard of hearing or deaf can still experience the story. That's making it more equal and more equitable because it looks at specific different barriers that people might face to access based on different features of their identity, of their experiences. Sometimes it can be difficult to measure how equal or how equitable something is because again, it's not tangible. It's not something that you can count, but you can also continue to look at what kinds of people are accessing, what kinds of people are feeding back to you on the games that they're playing or the space that you're creating. So in short, diversity is who you are. Inclusion is how you feel. And equity is being given the space to engage in the same way that everyone else can.
So in terms of all of that, it almost kind of feels like the conversation has shifted, right? Like as you said, diversity was the first thing that we talked about. And there's still, of course, diversity in hiring, et cetera, and everything that's going on. But in terms of representation, and I hesitate to say this a little bit because one of the breakdowns I've been doing is going from like 2010 onward and just looking at main characters in critically acclaimed games, so games over 90% on Metacritic, what ones feature women or a person of color, right? Someone who is not a white man, just to see, right? Like, because there's nothing wrong with those games. I've played a lot of those games. I really enjoy them. But I like started to get curious because I was like, have I just not noticed, right? Has it gotten a lot worse? Like, is it mostly just people who are diverse being featured in games now? What's happening, right? It's pretty shocking, like to me at least. In the early 2010s, I haven't gotten all the way through. When I started like a spreadsheet and started like color coding it and just realizing the lack of women or anyone who is not white featured as a main character in a game. That to me was really like, oh, hooray for Street Fighter. You're out there doing work. In Civilization 5, let's be fair, I think it was either Civ 6 or Civ 5 was on the list too, and I was like, yeah, we got two. Okay. I'm sure it'll get more as we get later on, but even thinking back to last year and the Game of the Year nominations and all of that, it doesn't feel like an overwhelming amount is non-white men featured in games as main playable characters. I think Spider-Man 2 had Miles Morales. I think that might have been it for main characters in Game of the Year. Could be wrong. Don't have it right in front of me, but
something like Baldur's Gate is an interesting example because
yes,
you create your own character, right? And it's I think there was a section from a talk that Kim Belair gave, who's one of the founders of Sweet Baby Inc. And she was talking about playing Mass Effect and a scene very early on coming up in Mass Effect 2 where her main character was talking to a black character, and she'd created a black main character because she was black woman, is. And so the game for her provided representation that if someone had, she then talks about her friends who might have created a white main character, wouldn't have got that representation. So I think when we see games like Baldur's Gate that allow you to create your own character, that can also allow that's a form of representation. That's equity, because everyone can create a hero that looks however they want it to for them. If you want to create a white man, you can. If you want to create a black woman, you can. You can create any kind of character you want, and you can play them however you want. Um, I think that it's a slightly separate category, those games that have customizable player characters. But when you look at games that have specifically made the choice to center a certain type of character, it is less. I was thinking before this, I was thinking about Final Fantasy and the Final Fantasy series. It's a little bit murky because there's like the main series games and there's spin-offs, and there's some debate about around what counts as a main series game. But I was thinking about Final Fantasy 13 and Final Fantasy 10 and 10-2. So Final Fantasy 10 features Yuna as the kind of very plainly secondary protagonist, and she's a character that I think was received really well at the time and is still quite a liked character by fans of the series. And she was the main character of Final Fantasy 10-2. Which was a direct sequel. I think it was the first time that the series had really done a absolutely clear-cut direct sequel to one of their games. And there's some debate around was that a main series game or was it a spin-off? But I think broadly people were okay with that at the time, with a female protagonist. I think a part of that is perhaps because they were familiar with Yuna and her story, and she was well received, and that the reason she's the main character is probably because she was well received. And then Final Fantasy 13 was the next, or the first, however you look at it, main series game to then feature a female protagonist who was called Lightning. And it's interesting. She was kind of described by, I think, one of the writers or character designers as a kind of female version of Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, who is a really, really well-liked character. And obviously the Final Fantasy VII remakes are doing really well and people are really responding well. But I think it's really interesting because I was looking at some of the receptions to her character, and that game came out in 2010 in outside of Japan. And for those that are familiar with Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, you'll know that he's quite an emotionally withdrawn character for a large portion of the game, and he's very stoic and very reserved. And I think that Lightning's character has a similar thing. She goes through a similar arc of starting off very closed off and reserved. I think I think the similarities are quite interesting because she's also very direct, and she's absolutely a fighter and a very strong, physically and emotionally strong character. But a lot of reviewers described her as too distant. She was too cold. She was too sullen. And I just thought it was really interesting that these are those similarities that made Cloud a very well-liked character. We see in practice, this idea of women being seen as a certain way versus men being seen as another way for exhibiting the same behaviors and the same traits. But I thought it was really interesting because she's also still a very not massively, but she's still a somewhat popular character within the fandom, and she's been voted as one of the higher ranking characters in popularity by fans and by polls and things like that. So I thought it was an interesting example. I don't know where Final Fantasy 13 ranked. I don't think it was above 90% in terms of critical acclaim, so it probably wouldn't have shown up if you were looking at that. But yeah, and I thought it was an interesting example.
No, well, it absolutely is. And the moment you said, similar to Cloud and he's stoic and all that, I was like, oh, they're gonna hate her. They're gonna hate her for the same reason. And I
Yeah.
saw a really interesting article about Baldur's Gate 3. I didn't read it all the way through because I was trying to find something about Baldur's Gate 3 creation. And in that, there was an article titled something like, if we want more women in games, we have to stop being scared of them. And it went through some of the storylines, and I've never played Baldur's Gate 3, but it went through some of the storylines of like why these characters have a right to be angry about what's happening. And I think it talked about Shadowheart quite a bit in particular, and explaining that like she has the right to be super pissed right now with the world. You cannot take that away from her. And if it was a man, we probably wouldn't be as upset about it. But because we're like, well, the women tend to cater to other people's emotions and like care for other people's emotions before their own, she should be doing the same. But we need to get comfortable with the idea that maybe she should also be looking after herself, right? And that's how we get like better female characters and better representation for women, is like stop critiquing them because they do something that you would be fine with the male character doing, right? Like let it go. Everyone has a different life experience. You need to let the perfect housewife vision go, because well, it's been long gone for a while, right? Like we killed that one off a while ago, so leave it in the past. Like we're done. We're done.
Well, it's also the fact that if only one type of story has been told for a very long time, people are going to be slow to then accept different kinds of stories. The other Baldur's Gate example is Lae'zel, who is a very direct character, and she very frequently will say, "I don't care about anything, but we need to do the objective. Come on, hurry up! Why are we helping this old lady get kittens back or whatever?" It's that classic kind of dilemma. We have an objective to do. And there was discussion online about. I think there was one tweet that started it off, which said something like, "If Lae'zel was a male character, no one would have any problem with her at all." And I think that's about 95% true. I think some people would probably still find it a bit annoying, but certainly not to the same level of hatred that she got. I think, when I played the game, I thought she was a really, really interesting and well-written character, and everything that she was saying made absolute sense from her perspective. But because we're not used to that kind of character, because we're not used to first of all, we're not used to a game rushing us, and a character in a game telling us, "Forget the side objectives, you've got to go, we're on a timer." But we're also not used to that coming from a certain type of person. That we experience that resistance. Again, we experience that I don't want to engage with this because this is different. I don't like it. And again, we see that for some people, that is their reaction to difference. That's their reaction to seeing something adverse. It's kind of fight or flight. And some people will put up a wall and push back against it.
As a very direct woman myself, like I'm gonna tell you, I've had that my whole life. Like the pushback of like, whoa, what's going on, right? Because again, it's the caring for everyone else's emotions and how people will feel before everything else. And there are just times when, at least in my personal life, it's like we don't have time for that. Like I'm really sorry, we do not have time for that. Like we're moving on.
Yeah.
Let's have things happen. But that really circles back to the whole diversity of like thought and experience and background that we talked about a bit, right? Like people come from different backgrounds. People in your walk of life, the people that you talk to at the grocery store, you don't know what they've been through. You don't know like how they're going to react to anything. And so it's just that crazy representation and so different. And the thinking representation can be done very differently in so many ways, right? Like there was a TV show like a while ago that I think it was like NBC or ABC called This Is Us, and it was just like a slice of life, like all about like some interconnected like triplets or something, right? And one of them was like adopted. It was like kind of kooky, crazy show. And one of the characters, though, Kevin, Kevin was very, every argument on Reddit when an episode came out was about Kevin, mostly. Kevin and the mom. Kevin did not get along with his mom. Like there were all these issues going on within their relationship, right? And everything that had happened over the years. And people, they either loved Kevin or hated him. I was on the love Kevin train. My mom hated Kevin. Like my sister hated Kevin, right? So there was arguments within the family, like passionate debates about this character. But one thing that came up in his storyline eventually was how he he's a Hollywood based actor, and he had a really bad like exercise addiction and eating disorder. And when I heard that, like coming from that character, it was very shocking. I thought it was great representation, though, and it's not something that you would normally see. Like a white man standing there who has like the Greek god body, basically saying like I've struggled so much with this like throughout my whole life. Like I was like, that's new. This is unique, right? But again, it was from a character that we've all seen before. Was a lot of the comments from people like we've seen this like, oh, I need to be fixed man in so many times over TV. And then they start to like slowly peel back the layers. And because the storytelling was just done in such a good way with the characters, it was a very well created character show. It kind of showed us like, oh no, he's actually like a little different. And we made him like a little bit more diverse in where he came from. Like we can all look the same and still have different experiences, different thoughts, different behaviors, different everything. So
Well, we've talked about this idea of telling more diverse stories, and one way to do that is to include more diverse characters, but also alongside that, it's making sure that you don't always tell the same. That those characters aren't always the same. We can tell different stories by using different backgrounds, different experiences that characters have gone through. Games would be boring if every single protagonist was the same. And interestingly, there's some pushback against these kind of AAA games, this idea of these AAA games that are always the same and kind of being churned out in a kind of very corporate way. But there's not necessarily been the same level of pushback against the stories that are told, even though I think there is a lot of homogeny in the stories that are being told historically. Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're recognizing the sameness in some aspects of gaming, in the gameplay, and I mean some of it's very obvious when it's loot boxes and microtransactions and all of that, but we're not always recognizing or responding to the sameness in storytelling or in character design.
that's actually an incredibly interesting thought. Like the moment you said that, I was like, what is happening? And it's interesting because like when you take it and you look at it even from Assassin's Creed gets the critique, it's the same thing again and again and again, right? Like at this point we've churned out, we've seen so many. And I start to like think of the characters that they've told. And the Ezio storyline was such a strong story, right? Like he got 3 games and he shouldn't have. The story was still about Desmond. Like I'm not sure what happened. They kind of just like, it felt like Ubisoft was just like, and Desmond's story is over. Like we'll just
Yeah.
get rid of him at this. I remember being a kid and being so invested in like Desmond and like all his little gang in the modern world and being so excited for any progression. And then like they hit gold with Ezio and they were like, just keep going, just keep going. But we did.
But actually, I think that's a really interesting. That highlights a really interesting thing. We're not interested. I think a large portion of the industry is not actually interested in telling authentic stories or telling interesting stories that people are going to respond to. It's interested in telling the stories that are going to sell games, and the commercialization aspect is also another piece of this puzzle that might need to be addressed at some point.
I haven't kept up with all the Assassin's Creed games, but you said that, and again, what comes to mind is one of my favorite ones was Assassin's Creed 3. I thought the story was heartbreaking. Like that really resonated with me. And that's what began being a Canadian and like our history with the Indigenous and everything that's gone on up here. That's when I really started to think about it more and like get more connected to that part of being a Canadian and that being part of our history. People did not like it 3. I remember they were super mad about it. Like thought it was a bad game. This, and this. What a terrible follow up to Ezio. Loved Black Flag. I remember being so frustrated at Black Flag's mechanics that I abandoned it before I even finished it. That was the last one that I played. I have the collector's edition, like the little flags up on the wall behind me. Like this was I loved these games so much. Every single year, my mom would get me that for Christmas because she knew I wanted it. She's like, here you go. Like, here's your next Assassin's Creed. Okay, thank you. Great. Like, I'm going to go play this like all year now. So it's fine. But there was something about 3 that just like, it was an uncomfortable story. Like it was talking about how like America took the land from the indigenous. Like, of course it's going to be uncomfortable. People didn't like it. They were like, nah. And then you look at
Well,
you look at other games, so like Spec Ops: The Line, if you're familiar with it at all, it's about like PTSD and soldiers, but because we've seen the soldier stuff so much, people loved that. They heralded it. Equally as uncomfortable, that story. Equally as uncomfortable.
well, it's again that fight or flight thing when we're faced with discomfort. And again, some people will, but I think there is a difference in that the Assassin's Creed 3 storyline, to an extent, encourages people to reflect a little bit on themselves. In a way that something like Spec Ops Line doesn't necessarily to the same degree. And I think that's the bit that pushes people into defense. And part of what people are talking about when they're against these ideas of diversity and inclusion in gaming is the idea of being preached to, or the idea of virtue signaling. These are often things that come up that people are against. And I think for some people, the idea of a video game, a medium that has historically been about fun or about a power fantasy or about kill all the bad guys, that's quite simple. Something like that turning into, like we said earlier, it was video games as art suddenly started to become a thing. A video game holding up a mirror and encouraging people to self-reflect on themselves and on culture. For some people, that's uncomfortable, especially when it seemingly comes out of nowhere. And again, I can understand why some people might react emotionally or react extremely defensively. I don't think that that's the most appropriate way to react, but it is uncomfortable for some people to see that.
And I do know what you mean, especially like the Assassin's Creed 3 was kind of, I saw it coming, like the boiling up point to the end. Like I was like, oh no, like this isn't gonna go well. My sister Ashley watched me play. She like got hooked at one point. She was like, wait, when is this happening? And she was like, Alana, this is gonna be so bad. Like the ending's gonna be so sad. And so we were there, like she was with me when we finished it. And so we saw it coming, but I understand like the idea of like maybe if you don't know that history as much, and I was homeschooled, that was not taught in public schools a lot. Like most schools do not have classes on Indigenous history and everything that happened. And if they do, it's very one-sided. Like it's the government, not to be tin-foily, right? But we know that the government does play a role in education.
Sure.
And they're saying like, well, and if you don't have a teacher that knows enough because they didn't know enough, right, then it becomes out of left field, like you said, right? Like they weren't expecting to have that reflection of, oh, that's a little rough. Yeah, I feel a little bad.
Yeah.
And most people use video games as escapism, right? Like let's not kid ourselves. Like I do it. I use roguelikes, right? Like had a long day, sit down, like do a couple runs, feel much better. Like that's part of it.
Normally feel much better unless it's Hades and you have to fight the boy in the ball.
But. Yes. Yeah, normally feel much better. And I think actually that's why I strayed away from RPGs for such a long period of time, though. I've recently rediscovered them through Village and Biohazard, and now suddenly I'm actually like really interested in them again. I'm like, maybe I could enjoy these, right? But for me, it was I always said like the story does not matter. Like, does the game play well? I'm done with stories. I don't want any part of this right now. Like, I just want a game that plays well. And I think that's also kind of a bit a part of the conversation is maybe, I don't know, like what, I wish we could have a larger breakdown of the people who are very interested in this curation group and very interested in avoiding the Sweet Baby Inc. games, because when it comes down to it, like I'd love to know what genres they play. You know what I mean? Like, are you story people or are you not? Right? Because if you're not RPG people and you're not there for the story, this honestly doesn't. It's not relevant.
it's not going to affect you.
Yeah, like go
Doesn't,
play
yeah,
your roguelikes. Like go
yeah.
play your deck builders, go play, your competitive FPS. Like that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Everyone plays different things. Play your MMOs, who cares, right? Like who
Mhm.
cares? But if the story is like that's the core of the game, then this is extremely relevant to you if you feel like you're being like pushed out, right? Like you're not allowed to be there anymore.
Well, I think as well, it's interesting that I think there are also a group of people who are there for the story, but perhaps in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps in a different way to people who are interested in hearing diverse stories, right? So I think about Dragon Age Inquisition, which was the third in the series, and it features one of the companions is called Dorian, and he's a gay man, canonically, and his little companion side quest involves him um, kind of confronting his father, who has consistently for all his life been trying to set him up in an arranged marriage with a woman. And there's a kind of fantasy element as well that I think mirrors some real life aspects, because the father also, it kind of comes out that the dad has tried to use magic to stop him being gay, which kind of draws a real world parallel to conversion therapy. Um, and a lot of people didn't like that, this going through that story, because what they said was I think a lot of people felt like it was a certain moral viewpoint was being forced upon them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the outcome that you can have from that quest, and the bit that you can influence, because Dragon Age is a game that's about your main character influencing the story. The bit that you can influence is kind of whether he um, begins the reconciliation process with his father
Mm-hmm.
or just walks away from him completely. That's kind of the two choices that you have. Um, but you can't. I think this was the right stance to take. You can't do anything but condemn what his dad has tried to do in terms of like converting him, probably for the best. Um, but I think it's things like that where people will be interested in a game for its story, and they'll be interested in the story, but then they'll feel like a certain moral viewpoint is being forced on them. That's often a lot of what I see when I see, there were some similar smaller scale things about other Dragon Age games, about Mass Effect. A lot of those choices matter story driven games where there is a resistance to diverse storytelling. I think that's a lot of what comes up.
One really interesting Twitter thread, and I don't have it open in front of me, and I don't think I couldn't find it like right at the drop of a hat, is actually from the God of War Ragnarok narrative lead or creative lead. And it was when the trailer came out and people were upset that Angrboda was a black woman. The thread is interesting for all sorts of reasons. I particularly enjoy the defense of, well, like, why it doesn't matter. Like, we changed so much about these gods already. Like, it's why are you upset about this one type thing, right? Is the question that he's asking, which is a fair question. But part of it, he talks about how writing is always political. Like you are always setting an agenda, right? And we like think about like great literary works, right? Uh, Crime and Punishment. I hated that book, by the way. Such a boring book. Hated that book.
Yeah, yeah.
But
And
Crime,
anything that I was forced to study in school for English class, absolutely sure, probably really great
yeah,
pieces of art or
yeah,
politically really
yeah,
interesting. Couldn't stand it. We had of Mice and Men. Makes a lot of really great points. Really interesting piece of art.
yep.
Can't stand it.
As well, I don't think they're meant for kids and most. I think that's our biggest
No, that
mistake.
too.
Like, we're not kids are not meant to read these. Crime and Punishment was actually I asked 1 year for my family because I wanted to give me a birthday gift. Still, I said, "Give me your favorite book, like, and tell me why it's your favorite book. I'd like to read it." I got a wild range of books. Like, it was so kooky, crazy what I got from them. And my one sister though was like, "I can't pick, so I'm going to give you two. I'm going to give you Crime and Punishment and Catch 22." I still have yet to read Catch 22, and that's embarrassing because this was a long time ago at this point. But Crime and Punishment was
Is she
just
going to watch
like,
this? Because
it was a slog. Like, I was like, okay, I had to take it on vacation with me and like sit outside in the nice sun and be like, I'm gonna read this. Like, I'm gonna read this. And then I figure out afterwards it was like a serialized, like weekly thing. And I was like, I probably would have read it that way, to be honest, if someone had told me. Like, maybe that, I wish that had been communicated, right? But no, but it's still an important piece of art, very political piece of art, right? Most paintings that we go and view, like in museums, and one of my favorite things to do when I travel is I go to like art museums and I just read and learn about political things happened here. The only reason why we have Van Gogh is because his wife was like a mastermind and was like, I'm gonna only like trade his pieces to specific people and like learn specific things from them. And if video games were considering them an art form now, like we have to bear this in mind, right? It is political. Like at the end of the day, everyone has an agenda, right? I guess the question is how much are you willing to tolerate, right? And I I just don't know if I would include like an agenda as having a black character or having an Asian character in a game. That doesn't feel like an agenda to me. It feels like that, oh, that character's black.
Mhm. It's interesting because first of all, I agree. Art is inherently political. I know the Twitter
Mm-hmm.
thread you're referring to, um, and yeah, it's absolutely. If we want to consider video games as art, it's exactly what you said.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really great soundbite. Take that one. If we want to consider video games as art, they are inherently political. That's that. The end. Um, and it's interesting what you say about. I don't think that a character being black or disabled or bisexual
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, I don't think that is political in itself as an isolated thing. I think that it has become politicized, and I think that to a point, I think it might be. I think the act of it, it depends how it comes about, right? I think the act of deciding, actively choosing to make a character any kind of specific minoritized identity, I think it could be political. I think that trying to tell all different kinds of stories is not political. So there's a game coming out called Zao, Tales of Kanzera. It was announced at the Game Awards, and it features an all-black cast. They've also got a cast of voice actors who have voiced the game in the native language of the setting. I think a situation like that, I don't think that's political. It's just telling a story that's set in a place where all the characters happen to be black. I think that choosing to make a character a certain identity when it's not at all related to their story could be perceived as political.
Mm-hmm.
Does that all make sense?
An example of this actually, um, and this is only, I guess, like the deep comic nerds would know this, is Kingpin being cast as a black man in the original Daredevil movie, that like the 2000s one, early 2000s one. And the reason why it's relevant is because in Kingpin's storyline, and I actually don't know if this comic came out before or after the movie, so I couldn't tell you for sure. There's like 4 or 5 gangs within Hell's Kitchen, and within a weekend, like Kingpin takes the Kings, which is a white gang, becomes the leaders of it, and then merges it with another gang and just like slowly absorbs, like, well, slowly, I think he does it in like a week or two period, grabs all the gangs and becomes the Kingpin. So it's actually relevant to his story because gangs are so racialized often that he has to be white, right? And so making the political, like the decision to make this guy black for the movie, like I could see why people would be like, I'm not okay with that one, right? Because unless you change that storyline and change how it happens in the movie, which they could, that's fine then, right? You've changed it at that point. If you're being honest though to source material, he's got to be white in that case, right? Just because he started in the white gang, it's the Kings, he becomes the Kingpin, etc., right?
Well, I think there are situations where that is the case, where a character has to look
Hmm.
or be a certain way. But I think those are very few and far between.
I
And
agree. Yeah.
I would actually say that I don't know the story all that well, but from what you've said, I don't think that's an example where a character has to be white. I think if Kingpin is black, it makes him even more powerful that he is somehow able to take control of this heavily racialized thing
Hmm.
in the context of him being black, right? That makes him an even more powerful villain
You're
potentially.
not wrong.
Potentially,
You're not wrong. Yeah.
that's
I've never. Yeah.
it opens up a different way of telling the story.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that is only the more ways that we have of telling the stories,
Hmm.
the better, right? There
Absolutely.
have
Yeah.
been countless depictions throughout the years of Kingpin, of Spider-Man villains, of
Hmm.
Batman villains, of all of these things. There've been countless depictions. If they're always the same every time, it's not interesting. It's not exciting. It
No.
starts to wear down.
Yeah.
But suddenly, if a version of the story comes along where something about the character is intrinsically different, everyone takes notice of that.
Hmm.
You've captured people's attention, and it allows you, as long as it's done properly, to tell the story in a different way. If you're comfortable with this,
Hmm.
I think what you've just said about Kingpin is really interesting
Hmm.
to start that off, because you have a perception of what Kingpin looks like in your
Hmm.
mind, and when a different portrayal comes up, you find that challenging. That's totally fine. That's not something to be shunned. Some people are are experiencing that, something that challenges their perception of what a character should be or should look like or should sound like or whatever, and are pushing back as hard as they can against it because they expect games that they're centering themselves and their own desires in in what they expect from games, you know.
No. I mean, yeah. Right. Like that's that's what this all boils down to, right? The Sweet Baby Ink stuff, because it's about people feeling comfortable, and we want more people to feel comfortable, but we don't. I don't want to make the people who already feel uncomfortable, but we might have to head down that path like that.
If we're going to engage with art, sometimes it's going to challenge us.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's going to make it. We talked about this earlier. Sometimes it's going to make us have to reflect on. We're going to be faced with something we don't like,
Hmm.
that we don't initially, that doesn't sit comfortably with us for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it's causing us to reflect on something that we haven't considered before. Maybe it's because it's uncomfortable to watch or uncomfortable to look
Hmm.
at. That's going to happen. And I think that people broadly, I think that everyone can get better at sitting with that discomfort, and like we said earlier, trying as hard as you can to not react immediately. Um, just taking a moment to go, oh, I don't know about that, and think, just think about what it means. And if the conclusion that you come to is no, I still don't like it, I still don't want to engage with that again, that's okay. Um, you know, don't play that game again. Don't engage with that piece of art again. But at least you've thought a little more critically about it, rather than reacting purely off of that immediate first emotion reaction that you have, which is something that we all, that's how our brain works. We process something, whenever we see anything new, we process our opinions on it in an instant, and a lot of the time those immediate opinions that we have are not always correct, or are not always going to lead us in the right direction. If you take the time to stop, to reflect, to just consider, you might find a different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. And you might find a better perspective, right? Because you're able to have that discourse and that conversation. Because what's really important to me with Gamergate 2.0 is the solution, right? And it's like finding like how do we actually how do we get something good out of this now, right? Because harassment campaigns are not good. It doesn't matter who they're against. This is not a beneficial thing. It's not beneficial to like specifically just get angry that we're not the only person being represented anymore, right? Like these aren't good things. And so how do we get there, and how do we engage with the other side, and how do we create the open space for dialogues besides what we're doing just now, right? Because hopefully this hits the target audience, which is not so much the people in the movement, although maybe they'll see it and be interested by it. It's people in the middle going, I don't know what's happening. Like,
Yeah.
what's going on?
I think so. There are two things. One is separately about the industry, and I'll come on to that in a little bit of kind of what I'd like to see. But I think the thing that we all have to get better at is being wrong and allowing other people to be wrong.
Mhm.
So I talk about this a lot in my work when I talk about diversity and inclusion and equality. We're all going to get it wrong sometimes. We're all going to say the wrong thing. We're all going to upset someone when we don't mean to. That's going to happen. We're people. No one knows everything about anything. Certainly not a topic like this that is so emotionally charged and is about people, and is, you know, we're still figuring it out. So I think we talked a little about that discomfort. We have to first of all get better at accepting that you might have done something without intending to, without meaning to. You might have said something that has upset someone else, and sitting with that and going, okay, let me figure out how I can avoid that next time. Not about censorship. It's not about pandering to other people. It's about just being a bit nicer. You know, it's about just being more considerate. I can't envision a situation where that is a negative thing. But we also have to get better at allowing other people to be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is an expectation, particularly from some people who are very knowledgeable about diversity and inclusion, or about certain identities. There is an expectation for other people to know or to have done the research. And I think I understand where some of that comes from, because the attitude is kind of, well, if I can put the time in and do the research and figure it out, so can other people. Which is true. Everyone can research and learn and try out new things and figure it out and ask questions, but we shouldn't have that expectation that they do. I think that we should allow people to say the wrong thing or to ask questions that might seem like stupid questions, without putting on the spotlight and going, you shouldn't say that, you said something wrong, because that's going to evoke a defensive reaction 100%. Sometimes we need to tell people, don't do that. Sometimes that is absolutely the right response. But I think that a lot of people get scared away from conversations about inclusion for that fear of getting it wrong and being called out. And we can all do something about that. Those individuals can say, okay, I'm scared of being called out, but I'm going to try anyway, because I have good intentions, and I'm not, and if I do upset someone, I'll use it as an opportunity to learn. But also the rest of us can go, okay, they probably shouldn't have said that. Let's talk to them about it and help them to learn, rather than just pushing away. So I think that all of us can get better at having the conversation. And I always encourage people to just talk about it. Just ask questions to each other about these topics. If you don't understand certain identities, if you don't understand why certain stories are being told, go to someone else and say, hey, I don't get this, do you get it? And maybe they'll help you learn, or maybe they'll also go, no, I don't get it either, but let's talk about it anyway. And you'll try and figure it out, and you're starting a conversation. You're starting a dialogue that might then lead to someone else getting involved in the conversation, or you going and doing some research, or reading about it, or watching another cool podcast from Alana, or whatever, you know. But just starting the conversation is the most important part.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because I think the general media and most people have the opinion that gaming is a very antisocial thing to do. But if you go back to the very beginning, for most of us, especially, the elder millennials, as they're called now, it started with your friends or maybe your parents or your siblings, your cousins, whoever, and you on a couch together and you were figuring things out together and like talking and actively interacting while you played the game. I think that's grown a lot. And that's part of the reason why I think Twitch is so popular is because a lot of people have that nostalgia, right? Of like, I used to love watching my older sibling play this game or my younger sibling, and they aren't here anymore to play this game with me. So I'm going to go watch someone who will play it because I would never play this game myself. And I want to see it from someone who would enjoy this game.
Mhm.
And I think the way that you just expressed, if you don't understand the story, go talk to someone else about it. That brings us back to like the core of gaming, right? Like it's a social thing. Like don't just
Mhm.
like sit there and play Baldur's Gate 3 by yourself or Dragon Inquisition by yourself or Halo by yourself and like turtle up and be like, I don't like this story and here's all the reasons why, right? Like you could just talk about it with your friends and maybe you would learn something about them, they would learn something about you, and at the end of the day you've bonded with someone, right? Because you have that like shared experience of like we both played the same game and now we've discussed it and like shared what we think about it. And I think, yeah, it's just like part of this conversation comes back to the core of gaming, right? Talk to your friends.
I really like that, and I hadn't actually considered it from that perspective. But I've had so many conversations. I think we've had conversations before where we might have both played a game, and actually I might have liked something about it that you disliked,
Mm-hmm.
or vice versa. And it's just interesting to hear. Oh, but why did you like it? Here's why I didn't like it. Why did you like it? That's just interesting. That's just if we're passionate about gaming, we want to talk about it more, right? Um, oh, I really liked that they portrayed the character in this way, and here's why. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like it as much because of this, but actually you might learn something about why it matters to someone else and realize that actually, oh, it doesn't actually make a difference to me whether this character is black or white, but it makes a difference to someone else. And that is really cool, you know? The other part of this that I would like to see is I'd like to see game developers say something.
Mm-hmm.
Just say something. And we're not seeing this in a lot of places, but something that did happen about a month ago. So Baldur's Gate 3 won Game of the Year again at the DICE Awards. By the way, Go Woke win every award in existence possible. But Baldur's Gate 3 won Game of the Year at the DICE Awards about a month or so ago. And during the acceptance speech, the director of publishing directly referenced the layoffs that have been happening in the gaming industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he said in the speech, it's kind of the elephant in the room that it hasn't been talked about a lot. And I think it was a really powerful moment, just that he said it out loud. Likewise, I'd like to see gaming devs say more about this topic. We're seeing it here and there. The threads about Angerboda from God of War Ragnarok
Mm-hmm.
that you referenced earlier. We're seeing certain comments being made, but I think I would like to see a stronger stance being taken, whatever that stance is. If the
Mm-hmm.
stance is we don't want to put certain characters in our game, fine, you're entitled to that opinion. Say it out loud. But I think there was a quote that I highlighted from one of the articles from Kim Belair, who again is one of the co-founders of Sweet Baby Inc., who said they have to assume that without Sweet Baby's intervention, that would be a white character, because surely my heroes agree with me. Surely these game devs agree with me. And I just think that there needs to be. I think we could benefit from more being said by devs about why they want to tell all these different stories. And I would love to see, maybe this is going a step too far, but I'd love to see a game dev say, here's the story we've made, and if you don't want to hear this kind of story, don't buy the game. It's not for you.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll ever see that for a very long time, but That's what I'd love to see.
Yeah. Well, because that it's capitalism, right? Like, and
Right.
as much as we like talk, there's been a lot of conversations that I've seen. Particularly, there was a set of interviews. I don't recall everyone who was there, but I know they were under an alias, but they were a former. They were claiming to be a former game executive, and they were using like a VTube model. And they were discussing that I guess at the GDC, a lot of the rhetoric is that the game developers are upset and they're seeing what everyone in the Sweet Baby Inc. detected is seeing, and they don't want to feel pressured into this amount of diversity and inclusion. And there's all this stuff happening at the GDC and all these panels that have to do with, well, what they would call wokeism and everything that's going on. I started going through the GDC panels because you can see all the listings online, and was like frantically searching because I was like, there must be some. I didn't find a lot. I might have seen one or two that I was like, well, that's actually probably useful, but I could see why people would be upset about the title, right? Because it's a little, it's trying to like poke something, right, and trying to like ignite fuel under you so you'll pay attention to the panel. It's probably trying to be controversial on purpose. What's been really interesting though is this GDC is, I think, in my opinion, the most we've ever seen coverage wise come out of it. You never hear about the GDC, and all of a sudden this year it's like GDC, 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 GDC. And a lot of what they're talking about though is like they're trying to improve their skills because of the layoffs. Like the rhetoric is not in, from what I've observed, and I could be completely wrong because I'm not a game developer, it is not right now wokeism is ruining the industry and it's destroying things because there's a claim that it's going to self-regulate and these games are no longer being purchased despite the fact that games are on the rise. And if there is a lack of purchasing, I think it could probably be equated to the recessions that are coming and hitting a lot of markets. Like there's a little bit of a dip, but it kind of lines up with a lot of that stuff. Not to mention things like, you know, PlayStation Plus, like the Game Pass, like all these ways to get these games for free. Like, why are people going to buy them when it's going to come to Epic Games for free and like within the next year or something, probably, right? Like, there's no point. Like, unless you really want to play that game, don't buy day one anymore. Like, that's basically the thing. And a lot of this rhetoric is not based on I don't want more wokeism in my games. It's based on I want a job. I want a job.
Yeah, yeah. That's and actually, you know, I say I'd like to see game devs talk about this more. I'd also like to make sure they have a stable industry to work in
Yeah.
first. That's absolutely the priority. But you're right to say there is, you know, and we touched on the commercialization aspect as well. I think that different every game developer is going to have their own personal balance between
Mm-hmm.
I want to tell the most authentic story possible and I want to sell as many games as possible. Um, Everyone's going to be somewhere on that scale, and I think the Baldur's Gate 3 devs have been particularly at one end about wanting to just make the best story that they possibly can and make what they view their perception of the best game that they possibly can. And it has turned out that actually that correlates with selling a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It worked. And it's interesting because people view it seems like there is a perception that make authentic stories and make a commercially viable game are the opposite ends of the scale. But I don't. Baldur's Gate 3 is kind of a great example that I don't think that's the case. And when you look beyond gaming, again, there are countless pieces of research that say the most diverse and inclusive and equitable organizations financially outperform their competitors almost always, almost exclusively. You know, this idea of go woke, go broke is not the case. It's just not. And I think that more game devs could focus more openly on diverse and inclusive storytelling, but I'm not talking about diversity of identity. I'm talking about creating diverse stories that we haven't heard before. It might just so happen that those stories also feature people that look different from us. And that's okay, because it could still be a really interesting story. and it could still be a really interesting and engaging game and piece of art that you could enjoy, you know.
Well, I mean, my most favorite stories do not feature a white woman as the lead in games. So I
Well, you
think,
don't have any choice. You
yeah,
said
I
you went through the list.
there's a
Yeah,
few, but yeah,
exactly.
not yeah, definitely. I don't know, not the type of games that I like to play, and I think that yeah, some of the biggest impacts on me have just been like just random Billy Bob being featured.
Mm.
That's fine by me.
I really think that this whole situation is a vocal minority opposing opposing Sweet Baby Inc. But by
Hmm.
what I mean by that is opposing what Sweet Baby Inc. has kind of come to represent. And I think that we will only see more diversity in gaming
Hmm.
in the future. Um, Sometimes those games will be really good. Sometimes they might not be. Sometimes they might sell really well. Sometimes they might not. But like we said, this is not going to go away. And we talked earlier about the technological advancements and the speed at which they're coming. More people are able to create games now because of that. And interestingly, I think that's also where some of this has come from. You know, we didn't touch on this, but gaming as an industry has historically been it's a tech industry. So like all the other tech industries, it's historically been dominated by specific demographics. The more accessible gaming development is, because now people can do it from their own home, the more people are able to develop games, which means the more stories are able to be told. And there are some fantastic indie games out there that tell really exceptional, diverse, and interesting stories that we haven't heard before. I think that's only going to keep happening and keep happening at a larger scale.
Yeah, I agree with you. I know there's been like some conversations on from like indie developers saying basically like the payday's over at this point. They're not getting huge deals anymore from like Microsoft or Epic Games or whoever. But I still think that the people who want to create these games because they love the games and they have a story to tell, they're gonna still be on the up and up. If anything, people saying the payday's over might stop like some of the not so great broken games from appearing on the
Yeah,
Steam store or the
hopefully.
Nintendo store, and that would be great for
Yeah,
everyone. Like, I think everyone can agree. Please, working functional games, like
yeah.
priority one. Can
Just to
I
say,
play
when
it?
we talk about diverse games, we don't mean games that are unplayable. That's not an aspect of diversity
No,
that I want to encourage.
absolutely not. Like that's minus points off the equity and
Yeah, yeah.
accessibility. Like, not
It's
can't
not
play.
accessible.
Yeah,
If you can't play your game, it's not inclusive.
yeah, exactly. There you go. There you go. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this conversation, Jack? And sort of as a way to wrap things up.
um, I don't think so. I would just reiterate what I said earlier. Ask questions about things you don't understand,
Hmm.
and give people the opportunity to ask questions about things that you do understand.
Yeah, I agree.
That's our way. I think that's our best way forward.
I think so. Yeah, and open the conversations between the two sides because we need to like come together and actually have conversations instead of just
Mhm.
getting upset at each other. That's not productive.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, sometimes it's fun to read the tweets on Twitter. Sometimes of
Absolutely. Yeah.
people calling each other out. People are very creative.
We're never going to fix Twitter. We're never going to fix
No,
Twitter. Like
no.
Twitter's not a part of this conversation. It's not going to happen. It's on its way out. Let it go in whatever
Maybe
way it
that's for the
wants
best.
to. Yeah. But yeah, having just remembering like people, there's someone else on the other side of the keyboard, on the other side of the monitor, like someone going through something that they're going through and you don't know what it is. So we need to approach the conversations respectfully and have that have that opportunity. So yeah, space to ask questions. I think that's homework number one, right?
Definitely. I wanted to say there's an example that I thought of,
Mm-hmm.
and this refers back to something what I was talking about earlier about
Sure.
the feelings that those people are feeling
Yep.
about not being seen. And maybe you want to just chop this and put it back there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it'll be helpful, maybe it won't. So I remember when I was growing up, it was like the late 90s, early noughties, and it was the era of like the Spice Girls and girl power, boys rule, girls rule, boys rule, all of
Mm-hmm.
that. And when I was a very young child, I didn't understand the context of why that was important, of why female empowerment was important,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of systemic inequality. I didn't know anything about that. So when I was a child, I saw all of this girl power stuff, and I felt left out because I thought, but boys are cool as well, right? Because I didn't know, I didn't realize why that was important, and I think that for a lot of gamers, they're seeing a lot of games be celebrated for great portrayals of female characters, of disabled characters, of black characters, etc. And I think that because they perhaps aren't aware of why those stories are so important, I think that's perhaps where some of that feeling of being left out might be coming from.
Mm-hmm.
It's I wouldn't say it's malicious. I think it's misled, but I think that's what I mean when I say I understand where it's coming from. I think that because people don't necessarily have all of the context and don't realize, like I say, why these stories and these portrayals or these characters are so important, that perhaps is where some of that feeling of being targeted or being under attack, perhaps that's where some of that comes from. I don't want to diagnose
Mm-hmm.
people who aren't here to talk about it, but that's my perception of it. And I think that's where some of it might come from.
No, I think that's a really nice anecdote to like include, right? Like within, because it gives us like a personal look into like, hey, like you understand, right? And we both come from, to a certain degree, more marginalized community within the gaming sphere. Like I am a woman and you're gay, like uh,
And disabled,
that's
I got two.
that. There you go, yeah, and disabled. There you go, two right there, like rough. And so we come from those communities, so we have like some aspects of what it feels like to not be represented, right? But I'm, like I said, everyone feels it differently. Like to me, I've never felt the need to see a woman on screen. So for me, it's never been a big thinking point or like, wow, raw woman power, because I look to all these powerful women throughout history and just think of them as role models, right? Like they've been there, but that's also because of the type of person that I am, right? Not everyone thinks like that, and not everyone has been exposed to those stories either from the past and know about those people, or maybe they don't have them like to think about. Maybe they've been lost to time or something, right? So yeah, I think that was like a really nice sentiment. Yeah, I liked it.
think that I think that we could all benefit from taking the time every now and then to stop and go, this isn't about me.
Mm-hmm.
And when a when a black character is included in a video game, it's not an attack on me. It's
Mm-hmm.
not. It's nothing to do with me. It doesn't actually affect me in any way whatsoever. But it might matter to someone else. Really, like at the end of the day, it might make a difference to someone else, but it's not going to make a difference to me. And just that, I think, just that perspective and going, this isn't anything to do with me. So actually, I don't need to care either way. I think I think that would be a lot more helpful.
That's very
But
well said.
also,
Yeah.
but also, the step further from that is pushing that towards someone that it does matter to. I'm sure we'd all be fine with the concept of seeing a game. Oh, I don't really like this kind of game, but my friend does, so I'll recommend the game to them. Oh, this game isn't really about me, but my friend might relate to it, so I'll recommend it to them. Again, just just thinking about other people's perspectives a little bit more could be really powerful as well.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with the recommendation one, because I mentioned the other day in a Discord call that you were in that my Steam page is not like tailored to me at all
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
It's all towards my friend's taste, because I always click on the game because I'm like, that's a game that someone I know would like, so I want to link it to them. But then Steam thinks,
Yeah.
oh,
Oh, you love these
yeah, and
games.
it's like, no, I actually don't, but that's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah, that's fine. And we don't always have the opportunity to have like a diverse circle of friends. It's not something that you're always given, but when you do have a diverse circle of friends, you start to, I think, open your mind a little bit more and be more aware of how these things affect other people.
Mhm. But if you don't, that's okay.
Yeah.
If you're not in a position where you have a lot of different kinds of people around you, we're not, like you say, we're not always going to be in that position.
Mm-hmm.
But you can still try.
Yeah.
You can still you can still imagine what other people's perspectives might be. You might get it wrong, and
Mm-hmm.
again, that's okay. What's important is that you approach things with openness, with good intent, with respect. It all kind of boils down to respect at the end of the day.
Yeah. Respect one another. Who knew, right? Like, only the basis of most of humanity, but who knew? Who knew? Well, I want to thank you again for your time today, Jack, and for coming onto the podcast. I really do appreciate it. And I think this has been a productive conversation and hopefully a useful conversation for people listening, because, again, this issue really does boil down to like maybe looking at sources a little bit more and talking about how inclusion matters and what it's going to look like in gaming going forward. Because I think we are in for some big changes soon. So
It's coming, and you can't stop it now. No, thank you for having me, and I'm really glad that you found it helpful. I hope anyone listening has also found it thought-provoking,
yeah,
interesting, infuriating, whatever. But hopefully it's been an interesting conversation to listen to. And thank you again for having me.
yeah, absolutely. Well, we've said in the past, we both love attention. So if anybody has any thoughts for either of us, like, you know where to find us.
Please.
Yeah. So thank you again, Jack, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon about something else. So
Thank you, Alana.